Okay, great. It's wonderful to be here, and I really enjoy the idea that I have a kind of session before Darren Brown speaks, and my wife was very impressed with that too. And it's also very fitting as well, right? Because I'm sure with Darren Brown and with many of the presenters here, right, have kind of based their contributions over these couple of days we had together on their expertise with magic, right? And I'm going to offer something by way of contrast, because this presentation is all about inability and ignorance. Okay, so here we go, right? Yeah. Okay, so at the end of 2017, as someone with no prior experience of doing magic, I decided I would take a autoethnographic study of magic. Basically, I was interested in notions about learning, the kind of practical reasons associated with it, and I decided that I would embark on an attempt to become a magician as a way into thinking about questions about learning. Okay, so I got some instructional books. This is the first spread of the first instructions I got said spread the cards out, and I said, right, I'm going to capture that. Okay, so it looks pretty good, right? I'm a natural. No, but then I followed online tutorials. I did some training, one-to-one. I got some instructions. I read lots of autobiographies, and eventually, I started doing magic performances for the public. I'm not going to say I'm hugely experienced, but I've probably done about 30 shows now, a kind of academic kind of magic. After all that, I decided, because I'm an academic, right, I'd write a book about it. And so there's a book that's just come out. It's available on the internet as a PDF for free. If any of this sounds of interest, you can have a look at it. I'm not going to try to summarize the book now. One of the chapters, for instance, spends about 8,000 words, where I actually go through the first trick I learned, trying to think about what does it mean to try to follow the instructions, right? So that's the kind of qualitative stuff that I do. What I want to do instead is to kind of find out, kind of way through my experiences, and I want to do that by going back to kind of where I started, and that's by asking the question about what can we learn from studying novice and beginners. Right, so maybe some of you are familiar with this quote from Suzuki. The idea here is that the beginner's mind offers lots of promises in terms of how we can kind of get to know the world. Experts can often discount things that people new to an area, right, learn to appreciate. And so when I started up taking up magic, this was basically my philosophy, is why ignorance could be a form of strength. So not knowing anything was a real advantage in terms of how I was thinking about this. The question of who can discern what in magic is a really interesting one, as I came to learn. And here is a quote from Ortiz, kind of echoing a little Suzuki. And if those of you know the book Strong Magic, I mean, he makes the argument that magicians' prior familiarization with how effects are done leads to a kind of desensitization. Magicians can't appreciate what constitutes strong magic. And in addition to this, magicians develop very ossified forms of thinking, based on how they know things are done, rather than audiences which can be a bit more kind of free flow and not be kind of directed towards thinking about set answers. Now, despite the way Ortiz and others talks about experiences as limiting, one of the interesting things about learning magic is that there are all sorts of claims to expertise and experience all the time. So Ortiz in his book, right, goes to great lengths to talk about why he is an expert and why his experience is important in being able to tell you about how you ought to kind of do magic. It's interesting just thinking about Soma and the kind of work that happens here, where we're kind of very focused on data, trying to think about how evidence can be marshaled to say kind of what works in magic. But right, it's really hard to get away from introducing people, especially magicians, right, with some sort of sense of how just experienced they are, why you need to listen to what they say, and I'm just kind of, these sort of experiences made me just kind of curious, right, about the role of expertise and the way in which magic is portrayed. And one of the reasons why I think that's interesting, as somebody who was a beginner, was the kind of absence of any kind of way in which beginners might be a kind of useful objects for study. So, I mean, if you follow Ortiz's logic, right, and you said, because basically he says, look, lay spectators are very perceptive, and some magicians, not all, but he and some other magicians are also very perceptive as well, right? Now, if you thought, well, who's an audience or who's a group of people that kind of combine a little bit of knowledge about magic, right? They know some of the methods, right? But they're still very new to it, okay? And that'd be beginners, right? But I've never been to a conference and I've never read anything where anyone's ever said, hey, let's think about how beginners would understand this, or let's study them as a group, right? I don't know of any kind of work that's kind of done along these lines. So it's kind of interesting, like, there's a validation of lay audiences, and there's a validation of certain experts. And then you got this kind of big gap in the middle. And I don't know, that's just a reflection for me. Okay, so let me just give you a kind of few vignettes. That's all I'm going to do. Before I do that, I just want to talk a little bit about the magic I did. When I was learning, I recorded 30 sessions, me kind of inviting people around, doing magic, this kind of thing. And then I have public shows that I developed as well. And in these, I take a kind of particular line, which is going to be related to what I say next. So if we think about how we can kind of orientate to magic, the idea that there's magic, in a magic performance, we can try to be kind of, in a sense, sincere. So I can say, like, I'm reading your mind. Like, that's what I'm doing. That's what I'm doing. Or we can be ironic. So we can say here, if you take my magic wand and you say abracadabra, right? Everyone knows this is a bit silly. Magic can also be oriented to as a form of kind of revelation. So we can talk about, like, okay, I'm going to talk about how card cheating is done, okay, through this, right? We heard Laura talking about that. And it also has this possibility of being self-referential. So what I mean by that is, you can do an effect that's based on sleight of hand while you're talking about sleight of hand to the audience. Again, as we've seen plenty of examples of. In terms of what I've been doing, I've been interested in thinking about magic as a kind of form of method. And the way I do that in the kinds of groups that I set up is they're basically like focus groups. I go around, I do something, a bit of patter around it, and then I get audiences talking about it. And what I get them talking about is not so much what they saw and whether they liked it, but pretty much kind of how they're acting in those circumstances. How is this thing that we're doing together, magic, whatever it is, right? How are they contributing to this? And I'm getting them to think about their own roles in this process. Okay, so with a beginner's mind, let me just, again, just a few quick vignettes. So Ortiz, again, just another quote from him, right? So this is his last law in his book, right? The Strong Magic book, was always remain in control. And certainly in my experience, there's lots of ways in which magicians exercise control, right? We can issue people directives. They generally follow them. We have kind of rights about when we speak, just like in a presentation, right? If you're going to disrupt someone, you kind of have to have a reason and you have to do it at the right time. And the same with this kind of group magic that I've been involved in. But I guess my basic kind of point through all this is that magic isn't just something that's done by magicians, right? It's a joint activity, even though it's a very asymmetrical one. Okay, and that's what I've been interested in thinking about. Just like maybe when you go to the GPs, right? The interaction between you and the GP, right? They know a lot, right? A lot of things that you don't know, right? But there's still two parties, right, in this situation, and just so in the case of magic. So yeah, as I say, I just recorded a lot of sessions, and I was just interested in looking at how people act in those situations, and particularly for how they helped make the interaction happen. So people did a lot of things, these participants. They made sure that other people were following my directives, right? They policed each other's behavior. People would narrate what they were doing so others could follow along. This was an English crowd mainly, so when something did go wrong, they often attributed themselves with blame, which is all very, very sweet, right? People reported disengaging in certain moments, and part of the reason why that happened is that they wanted the tricks to work. They wanted to have a kind of a beneficial experience. Right? So there's all the kinds of ways in which there's the kind of joint activity taking place with magic. But I just wanted to focus on the last one very briefly. So social life, right, is a kind of coordinated activity, and it's happening all the time, right? It's kind of happening right now. But what's interesting is how often people kind of deny their own role in what's taking place in a given scene. So in my magic performances, I mean, people generally followed what I said, but they didn't just do that. Sometimes they did the opposite. Sometimes people would just pick up the deck, of course, look at the cards. I mean, lots of little, generally kind of playfully delivered forms of intervention. And whatever people did, I took time to kind of ask people about how they were acting in the situations. Why were they challenging me? Why were they not challenging me? And what I heard back by way of kind of accounting for this is that people were following a kind of norm, a code, or some sort of rule in magic about how they're supposed to behave. I mean, what's interesting about this evocation of norms is that, they were always saying their behavior was the norm following behavior, right? And that they were acting in relationship to these kinds of standards. It's maybe a little bit bigger issue than I have time to go into now, but I mean, in the case of magic, certainly the idea that there are norms that are followed is a bit of a fallacy. I mean, there aren't really norms about how you're supposed to behave as an audience to a magic performance, especially a kind of an alternative one like this. Norms aren't definite standards about how we're supposed to act, the things that we make through our interactions. But constantly within my experiences, people kind of posit this idea that there's something out there that's shaping how they should behave, rather than something that we kind of make together in the moment. Just quickly on a few other things. I think it's just to briefly kind of reflect on how beneficial it is to call yourself a magician, right? So when I started performing, I was just basically doing the self-working tricks. One of the interesting responses I got back people would say things like, "Oh, you're very good at this, Brian." And I said, "Well, what do you mean, right?" And I said, "Well, yeah, really." If you've seen anybody, no, but and what I heard back frequently was that people couldn't detect any kind of jiggery pokery going on with the cards, and there's a clear reason why, is because there wasn't any. So, but that's what they were looking for, and in the absence of that, they accredited me with skill. And also, I think it's just really interesting, this kind of realist conceptions we have of the world. It's out there, our senses delivered to us. I mean, this is the kind of orientation most people have. And if you like, so too with my audience members in terms of the way they reported on things. And then the absence of talking about themselves as being cognitively flawed, about having kind of perceptual limits. What they did tend to say, well, let me say it this way, that the world was ordinary made kind of my abilities extraordinary, right? It wasn't about them, it was all about me, my plans, my doing, all these kinds of things I must have been thinking through in terms of how the interactions would go. And then I had just a couple of experiences where I had some people who knew about things like inattentive blindness, right? And they would bring this up in tricks that didn't actually rely on inattentive blindness, but still it was this sense that I was somehow using this, as a basis for tricking them, okay? And again, kind of nothing going on with that, but all this stuff kind of just built me up as a performer. And anyway, I think that's interesting, and surely not the only area of social life where this kind of thing happens. And then just quickly, this is my last one. Yeah, I would. One of the things that's really interesting about magic as a form of learning, right, is you develop an eye, you develop kind of refinements in terms of your handling, your eye-hand coordination, this sort of thing. But you also learn about the limits of perception and memory and cognition. So learning magic entails this kind of double movement, right? Becoming more refined and learning about the limits of your abilities. And I just think that's very interesting. And one of the areas where I think it's, the question is like, well, how does that happen is in training sessions. So one of the things I was able to do, I was able to go to a master class with Danny Ortiz here. He was very kind enough to allow me to record a weekend of him giving instructions to people. And yeah, I was just interested in looking at detail about how he instructed as part of this. So sometimes he would ask us to watch what he demonstrated. Sometimes he would tell us to disregard what we could see because of what we knew. Sometimes he simply just told us what we were experiencing. Sometimes he asked us to imagine what wasn't being shown. Sometimes he said that we couldn't appreciate what we were seeing because we needed some sort of refined judgment, which he had. Sometimes he gave us foreknowledge and told us to disregard it. Sometimes he gave us foreknowledge and told us to mind it, right? And I just say these points because the question, like for a beginner, is like, how do you orientate to your kind of understanding of the world? Like, what is before me here? And part of learning is the ability to kind of move between these different ways of understanding your experience. Okay, I think that's a signal to me that I definitely need to stop. So anyway, that's a nice picture, isn't it? And anyway, so magic, you know, lots of asymmetries, but especially for myself as a beginner, I'm kind of interested in how audience and magicians do that together, and what kind of possibilities this offers for rethinking other kinds of relations. Okay, so quick tour, and do we have time for a question, or are we?